Hi, my name is Robin Wong, and I want to talk about the fundamentals of photography, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. I believe that there's no shortcut when it comes to photography, and every photographer should have a good basic understanding on how the fundamentals of a camera work. But I also admit that entering the world of photography, having just bought the camera, having to deal with so many unknowns, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, metering, white balance, focusing, there are just so many things to learn, and it can be quite daunting. So the aim of this video is to give you a quick explanation of what the fundamentals of a camera are, and I'm going to explain what shutter speed, ISO, and aperture in the best simplified manner as I can. This is not a complete beginner's guide, and I'm trying my best to keep things as straight to the point as possible. If you are new to photography, I want you to be able to pick up the camera, go out, and immediately start shooting, and you can learn from there onward. I believe that there are so many resources on learning photography out there. I'm not trying to compete with that. And what I'm trying to do is to encourage you to start shooting with your camera and start making images. The three exposure basics that are true to all cameras these days are shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. Understanding how each and every one of these settings work and how they interact with each other is very crucial to improving your photography. Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, they work in their own individual ways, and they can affect certain outcome of photography effects. We will discuss what they are, how they affect these specific photography effects, and how do we control them with Olympus OMD cameras. Let's start with shutter speed. Shutter, the word shut means close. So shutter is a mechanism that opens and closes in the camera to allow light or prevent light from coming into the image sensor. Therefore, shutter itself can directly affect the real amount of light that comes into the camera. How do we control the amount of light with shutter? Actually, by controlling the duration that the shutter stays open. So the longer we let the shutter stay open, the more light that we capture and the brighter the image will be. Now, the typical shutter speed of a camera can vary from 60 seconds all the way to 1/4000th, or if you're using a higher grade camera like Olympus OMD EM1 Mark II, you can go to 1/8000th of a second. Come to think of it, the mechanical precision to open and close at 1/8000th of a second, that's pretty insane. Now, because shutter speed controls the duration of time that the shutter opens and closes, it controls the duration of time that the image is being taken. Now, that duration can affect motion of the photograph. Shutter speed is what you need to control if you want to add blur in the image, or the opposite, to completely freeze motion. To completely freeze motion, select a much faster shutter speed. I can't give you a magic number. The faster the subject moves, the faster the shutter speed that you have to use. Now, to freeze a moving person, maybe a shutter speed of 1/250th, or if the person is moving very fast, 1/500th of a second is sufficient. However, if I'm taking photograph of a tennis player running around in a tennis court, a professional tournament, I may need 1/1000th or even 1/2000th of a second to completely freeze motion. If you're shooting action, sports, or if you want to freeze any kind of motion, just bear in mind that you need fast shutter speed. Now, going to the opposite of the spectrum, if you want to induce motion in your shot, if you want to introduce motion blur, slow down the shutter speed. Again, how slow the shutter speed actually depends on how slow the movement is. For example, to shoot a moving waterfall, I will actually go to about half a second or even 1 second exposure. To do a typical panning shot with the motion blur in the background, I can go to 1/30th of a second. Now, to get light trails at night, having the vehicles moving along the highway, to capture enough length of a trail, typically I will start at about 5 seconds. And having motion blur can add creative effects to your photograph. It can create the dynamic look that the photograph is not perfectly still, and yes, that can make your photograph look quite interesting. So there you go. Shutter speed controls the motion of the photograph. Either you want to completely freeze it, or you purposely introduce blur motion. To activate the shutter speed priority, turn the mode dial to S. You will see the word S at the bottom left of the LCD screen. Now turn the back dial to control the shutter speed. So the shutter speed is the number on the far left bottom, and it shows from 60 seconds with the double apostrophe at the top, and you can go all the way to about 1/8,000th of a second. You can turn the front dial to control the exposure compensation, which actually controls the overall brightness of the image. Besides shutter speed, another way that the camera controls the light that comes in is through aperture. Aperture is basically just an opening in the lens, and that opening allows the light to come through the lens, and when we control the size of the opening inside the lens, we control the amount of light that comes into the image sensor. The size of the opening, or the aperture of the lens, is measured by f number. The smaller the f number, the bigger the opening is. The larger the f number, the smaller the opening is. So it's the opposite. I was also confused when I started out in photography. It took me a while to realize this. So when we talk about bright aperture or wide aperture or big aperture, it simply refers to f2.8 or f1.8 or f1.4. Those are bright, wide, and big apertures. Now when we talk about small aperture or narrow aperture or stopping down the aperture, right, we are usually referring to big numbers like f8, f11, or f16. The smaller the aperture, the larger the f number. The typical range of an f number that we work with Olympus OMD cameras are from f1.2, which is the widest aperture lens that Olympus has to offer, and typically it stops down to f16 or f22. Also, it makes sense that when we shoot in dim lighting conditions, we will typically open up the aperture as wide as possible, typically staying at the maximum opening, right? If you're using an f1.8 lens, you might want to just open it up to f1.8 maximum aperture to gather as much light as possible. Why do we need to stop down and make the aperture smaller? For example, now I'm out in the open under this bright weather. So of course there'll be too much light, and by stopping down the aperture, we cut the amount of light that comes into the camera so that we can achieve a balanced photograph so that I will not appear overexposed. We have just talked about aperture controlling the amount of light that coming into the camera by opening up or closing the lens opening. However, aperture also controls another very important photography effect. That is the depth of field. When I talk about depth of field, it means how much zone on my photograph there is in focus. When I say shallow depth of field, it means that there's only a tiny part of the photograph that is in focus and everything else will be blurred. For example, this shot of me now standing here, you can see that I have a very pronounced background blur. This is a very shallow depth of field. Turn the mode dial to A for aperture priority mode. And once this is activated, at the bottom left of the screen, you'll see the word A. Now use the back dial to control the aperture. If you go to wide open, you can get the blurry background, which is the shallow depth of field. Now by stopping down the aperture to smaller numbers, you will get much wider depth of field. As you can see, the background is a lot clearer. Both aperture and shutter speed control real light that comes into the camera. This is not the case for ISO. Now the final component of this trinity works very differently. While shutter speed and aperture decides how much light comes into the camera, ISO then takes this amount of light and it doesn't add or minus the available light that is already there. What ISO does is that it will artificially boost the light when it's needed. Now I'll use a radio for example. The audio signal that comes through the frequency into your radio, it doesn't get louder or softer. However, there is an amplifier built into the radio that amplifies the sound. And the more you turn the volume knob, the louder the sound gets. That is the same with ISO. Now, because the shutter speed and aperture allows the light to come into the camera, the amount of light is now already fixed. And before the camera captures the shot, the ISO can boost the light signal, and this boosting is artificial. Similarly, when you turn the volume knob of your radio, what happens when you turn it too much? What happens when you keep turning the volume knob? the music gets louder. The louder it gets, if it's too loud, the sound becomes noisy and there is distortion and it's just bad. And the more you turn, the more distorted the sound becomes. Similar distortion happens to your image as well if you keep boosting the ISO up, and as it goes higher and higher, we will get image noise. And this is something that we want to prevent, and we will try to stay at lower ISO values so that we can achieve much cleaner results. Now bear in mind that in your Olympus OMD camera, ISO 200 will give you the best image quality in terms of noise control, dynamic range, and overall image sharpness. For EM10 Mark III and EPL9, there is a shortcut ISO button, which is at the up button. By pressing that, you can activate the ISO and you can control from ISO low all the way to ISO 25600. The ISO can also be controlled from the Super Control panel from all Olympus OMD cameras. Now that I've explained all the three different components of exposure, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, they all sound very easy individually, and it is not difficult to control them one by one. However, I think in real life situation, we do have to think about all three of them together. This is where things get complicated, because in mathematics, when we have three unknowns, we typically will need three equations to solve the problem. And the more unknowns we have, the more complicated things get. Here is what I can share with you to simplify things further. Don't think too much. Do not overthink when you're trying to take a photograph. What you have to do when you encounter a scene, just identify one primary objective. Just find one single thing that you want to achieve in that photograph and execute it. I know that this may not be true for all photography scenarios. You will come to a situation where you need to think about multiple considerations, but hey, for now, just identify one and work with it. If you want to shoot a portrait, you want to blur the background, don't think about shutter speed, don't think about ISO, just go to aperture priority, control the f number, set it to f1.8 or f1.2 and blur the background off. If you're shooting a wonderful looking waterfall, you want to slow down the movement of the water so that it looks silky smooth, go to shutter priority, dial down the shutter speed, make sure that it's slow enough to induce the blur motion. Now, if you're shooting sports, you're shooting action, right? Everything is moving very fast. It's very quick action. Now, go to shutter priority, increase the shutter speed, get the shot. If you're shooting in dim lighting condition, you know that it is very dark, the camera is struggling, then you increase the ISO numbers. I also understand that in real life shooting conditions, things are rarely this simple, but hey, I really want you to try to simplify things first before taking it up to the next notch. In specific aperture and shutter speed related photography effects, use aperture priority and shutter speed priority modes. One day, maybe you woke up at the wrong side of the bed, you have a headache, you're going to meet people that you don't like, and you just don't feel like taking photographs, but you do have to take some shots. So that's the time when you use P for professional mode, and P will allow the camera to control everything for you, and you don't have to think about the shutter speed or aperture. But by controlling the P mode or the program, you can still control the ISO and exposure compensation. At this point, I wouldn't recommend you to explore the manual camera settings where you have full control of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO because, like I said, three unknowns, three equations, making life too complicated. The day will come when you decide that the camera is not really giving you what you want. When you shoot with P, A, and S modes, the camera is not really giving you the results that you want. That is the time when you start to explore manual. Trust me, when that day comes, you will know what to do. I hope that my explanation was easy for you to digest. I hope that you have gained some understanding on how shutter speed, aperture, and ISO works and how to control all these settings individually in your camera. The best way to move forward and improve on your understanding of how all these things work is to pick up your camera, go out and actually shoot more photographs. You will actually learn more by shooting more photographs and also from the mistakes that you're learning on the field. I know that there are many things that I've skipped in this video. I didn't talk about metering modes, and I admit that I did oversimplify some things. But hey, my aim is to get you started, and please go out and enjoy photography. If you have found this video useful, please give me a thumbs up. Please leave me some comments below and let me know what else you want to learn from me. I'll try my best to do those videos in the future. I will definitely see you again in the next video. Bye-bye.